Hi, I'm John Gossley. Welcome to the fifth installment of Fjord's Reviews, hosting the Transatlantic Poetry Series. Today we're going to have two very great guests who I'm very pleased to host. Mona Arshi was born in West London, where she still lives. She worked as a human rights lawyer for a decade before she received a master's in creative writing from the University of East Anglia and won the inaugural Magma Poetry competition in 2011. Mona was a prize winner in the 2013 Troubadour International competition and joint winner of the Manchester Creative Writing Poetry Prize in 2014. Her debut collection, Small Hands, was published by Pavilion Poetry and is part of Liverpool University Press. Small Hands won the Ford Prize for Best First Collection in 2015. Claudia Rankine's third full-length book won the Ford Prize for Best Collection overall in 2015 as well. Our second guest today will be Chris Campanioni. His recent work appears in the Brooklyn Rail, London Journal of Fiction, and Prelude. He's worked as a journalist, model, and actor, and he teaches literature and creative writing at Baruch College and Pace University, and new form journalism at John Jay. His Billboards poem that responded to Latino stereotypes and mutable, and often muted, identity in the fashion world was awarded the 2013 Academy of American Poets Prize. I'd also like to take today to announce that starting in December, Chris Campanioni and I will both be the two of the new editors of Pank magazine. I'll be the publisher and editor, and Chris will be the managing editor, and we have some other very great people coming on staff. I'm also the director of C&R Press, which will be publishing 16 titles in 2016. And we are really looking forward to making some waves there. So, without further ado, here's Mona Arshi.
Good evening, or good afternoon to some of you. I'm going to start with The Lion. How unstable and old he is now. Lion like God has snacks sent up by means of a pulley. Although you can never master the deep language of lion, I am made dumb by the rough stroke of his tongue upon mine. Nowadays I make allowances. We lie together and I hear the crackle of his bones, and when I bring myself to open my eyes, he weeps, his pupils resembling dark, embroidered felt circles. Sometimes I think all I am is a comfort blanket for his arthritic mouth, that many evenings he'll sit twisted behind the drapery, solving my vulgar fractions with nothing but his claws. Lion and I break bread. I tend to his mane, and he sets 1,000 scented fuses under my skin. He starts undressing me under the sweetening stars. Please, girl, he mused, this might be the last time I will see how the thin light enters you. One more poem in a similar vein. This is Hummingbird. Ask the stems in the glass to bend, let your fingers fly a momentary grasp, slip into spaces, surge in and out of folds where breasts begin to curve and rise. Be God. Press your curing skin to mine, dissolve and pronounce me. Let my eyes fall out and embed in the carpet, rooting. My hands arrange the air for you, braiding. Reluctant sun at the window, open your eyes, burn through the haze with your severe love. Slide open the bone zip of my spine, anoint each rigid peak, take my limbs and fold me over. Here's my mouth, hummingbird, linger there and hold my breath. I'm going to read a poem called Entomological Specimens. There's lots of spiders in my first book, and it has a little note. Simply leaving specimens in a cyanide jar for a while will relax them, but this method is not reliable. Center of Insect Systematics. You will need to be pinned in the middle of your thorax. And darling, did you know that gin is preferable to vodka in the relaxing jar? I once saw butterflies mounted by an amateur. Glass too late, they became infested by tiny insects. I look over and you are transfixed, composed. Perhaps it's all the order, the systems in this quiet and simple world of corpses. Later, I saw spliced spiders displayed on framed plastic slides. I'm choosing a pair of lashes that I will wear for you. In the corner of my eye, I thought I saw one twitch. The next poem is Insomniac. My father was a shift worker, and actually she was always looking for cures for my father's insomnia, but actually she suffered worse than he did. And this is really a poem about that kind of verging on madness when you haven't had sleep. Insomniac. Never marry an insomniac. You will have to mind yourself. Have hemweight sewn into the lining of your garments. Cure your skin with almond oil until it's bloated and the pores are brimming. Purchase a large wooden grain trunk and place it near your bed. It's for safekeepings. Obscurely somewhere deep inside, you know all this. Very soon you won't be able to tell the days apart. You'll develop a tic and it'll distill at the center within the hive of your other small anomalies. You'll flail in mild wind, and when you speak, minute silverfish will consort in the pit of your throat. Exquisite wife to the shade, the exact point you place your fingertip on winter mornings, a raindrop will later stop and fret. It's a wonder if you survive at all. It'll all end in the mouth. You'll blink, he'll stir. You'll practice lying very, very still. Peacock feathers, your talismans, will blink back in their jars. This book, Small Hands, is my first collection, and I'm really, really interested in form. I had a very good teacher who taught versification, and I'm really interested in finding the right form for the poem. And there's something about the couplet that I'm really attracted to, and I think one of the reasons for that is because the ghazal, the form of the ghazal was very important to me when I was growing up. My dad used to write ghazals, and it's something about the music of the ghazal that's really important. And so the ghazal itself, which is older than the sonnet, has had a revival, and there's this real interest in transporting the ghazal into the English language. And there are a couple of ghazals in the book, Small Hands, and one is a sort of pure ghazal where I've retained the refrain at the end of each line. And I'll read that one first to you, and it's called Ghazal, and there's a little saying at the beginning, an Arab saying, I thought you my bird and built you a nest in my heart. Breathe me in this dishevelled night. I go unnoticed. The airs turn strange and solid. but only I will notice. If I allow beams of light to pass through the pinholes of my torso, and if light strikes the wall on the other side, would you notice? Tonight you're 3 parts God and 1 part sandalwood dust. I keep catching your scent by the window. I always notice. My words pile up like prophets on the point of my tongue. What passes for transparency are those things you don't notice. I steal robin's eggs and sketch powder down feathers for you. My pocket heaps a pulsing nest. The creatures never even notice. If you could let me bangle my arms around you, rain would fall. It would speck my lips, my open fingers, then you would notice. Instead, my eye remains locked in the platinum part of the flower. The highest branches are the only living things to notice. I'll just read that second ghazal. This also has a little note, little epigraph, which is from a play by Lorca, The House of Bernarda Alba. Not even our eyes are our own. I want to tune in to the surface beside the mayfly, listen to how she holds her decorum on the skin of the pond. I want to sequester words, hold them in stress positions, foreignate them, string them up to ripen on vines. And I want to commune with rain and for the rain to be merciful, a million tiny pressures on my flesh. I refuse to return as either rose or tulip, but wish to be planted under the desiring night sky. I want to be concentrated to a line under the pleat of your palm, and for it to radiate opalesque under shadow. I want God's fingers to break, and for you to watch as I fold my sleeve, reveal each detail of my paling wrist. At the centre of the book, the heart of the kind of quiet core of the book, are poems, elegies really, to my brother. My brother died in 2012, so whilst I was writing these poems, and so I really felt that I needed to address the grief, and it's one of the most difficult things to deal with. And I came across a poem by Denise Riley, which really affected me, and it really gave me courage to write about these very difficult things. And the poem is called Notes Towards an Elegy. Denise Riley's poem, which was published in the London Review of Books, is called A Part Song. And what was so interesting about the poem for me and so moving was the fact that it was about the death of her adult son. It's a very risky poem. It's lyrical in parts, and it's funny and dark in parts. She talks to her son in the poem. He talks back, and she says in the poem, at the outset of the poem, "You principle of song, what are you for?" So it's this sort of questioning of the poem about the nature of the experience that is also almost ineffable, that I liked about the poem itself. And so the poem that I've written, Notes Towards an Elegy, I want to acknowledge that it's difficult to write about these issues, and so I'll read that to you now. Notes Towards an Elegy. 1. Entirely occupied. A million throats migrate towards my ribs, secrete syllables in my chest. All pores and openings have acquiesced. I'm slurring in my sleep. 2. The accumulation of departures, mornings of staring down light. Blame the bend in the trees. Blame the abstract. Blame my stupid, dumb hands. 3. I've forgotten what silence feels like. Tongue loosened with no protest. My other tongue, a ceramic figurine, presses against my teeth. 4. What I know is that I'm straining to name the parts, have failed to name the parts of the poem. 5. The back of my hand inscribed with dates are like the hands of a small-boned boy sitting under the twitching shade of a tree. 6. We found the stumbling bird together and hand-fed her with white bread soaked in milk. We had to leave her by the green shed, and she did die. You noted the delicate integrity of its fretwork. 7. Wait, fast ghost. You should see how the living room is choked with living things, and your mother is upstairs, sitting on your bed, nurturing scraps in the poor light. I'll read one more poem. I'll read The Found Thing. The found thing. It infiltrated, left a trace in my mouth, and I wanted it. Emboldened, it began to colonize all those tight spaces, so I let it bed itself under my fingernails and drip into my tear ducts. It felt so warm, was my constant mute companion, became one of us on sports days, shopping trips, vacations. I never asked any questions, never wished to see its face. One morning it was just not there. I searched and searched, panic rising up in my throat, and I couldn't manage to say what it was I had lost and how. The final poem I read is called Barbule. Barbule. An opening or an opening of an opening. A junction between two nerve cells. The most distant thing you can see with the naked eye. A spasm or a gap. The residue on a stylus that makes a record jump. The term used for the hardening of infant gums during teething. The first blind rooting tips of a shoot. The effect of moonlight on an oblong pond, and an early word for virgin wool. An out-of-fashion raised cross-stitch, often associated with shrouds. A neglected silkworm that dies in its cocoon. The foul breath of an exotic bird, most commonly the peacock. Things you may find in winter boots. Clouds of tissue. A set of long laces tied with a reef knot. Perishing bands of elastic.
Thank you, Mona. That was a very moving reading. Next, we'll have Chris Campanioni, and then after that, we'll cover any questions that anybody has and fix the blinds in my apartment so that my face isn't half lit. Chris Campanioni's recent work appears in the Brooklyn Rail, London Journal of Fiction, and Prelude. Chris and I have been working together on a partnership we call Poetry Brothers for about the last year, where we attempt to get placed in the same edition of the same magazine. Very often we get placed in consecutive issues, which is still just as good for Poetry Bros. Hashtag Poetry Bros. So here is Chris.
Hey, welcome everyone. I think I want to start off with something that I think is close to me culturally, particularly in terms of my personal background growing up in a very mixed household. but particularly linguistically, growing up amidst Spanish and Polish intermingling with English, and not only English, but a very particular kind of English, that kind of English that's found in pop culture. I write often about pop culture, so I think this is sort of akin to an ars poetica. And kind of fittingly, it's named after the 80s band Talk Talk, which I think had more than one hit, but you probably only remember one song. And just a little background about this poem. It does appear in my most recent poetry book, Once in a Lifetime, which is named for a Talking Head song. But also, I was really fortunate. Minor Literatures, which is a really nice avant-garde literary magazine based in London and in Los Angeles. They just did a synthesis of my work, and I guess they're giving me a lot more credit than I would give myself when they mentioned, Jonathan Mark Antoni mentioned that in this poem, unlike my other work and unlike so much of my work, I really am not critical of technology, but I celebrate it as a space for joy and an actual connection. So this is Talk Talk. My father learned English on the radio. Sing-song Santiago Spanish. Rocks off the Rolling Stones. Your mouth don't move, but I can hear you speak. So many questions. People want to know what makes me what I am. I tell them way I was raised. I tell them gaga boom, gaga boom. Music everywhere in the house. Learning English on the ratio of aguacate y cebollas, kebasi, equal parts. We held our hips with each other's hands, formed a line. Carne con papa, carne con papa. Close to madness, we suffered such hunger. My mother learned English just by listening, too poor to afford even that simple luxury, audio or visual. Mistaken for a storyteller when she stood silent, eyes closed and wondering, like holding the hand of her child. And that's from my most recent poetry collection. But what I had been working on for the better part of, I guess, 5 months, and that I was fortunate enough to receive a publishing contract from CNR Press, is a memoir, is a poetry and prose memoir called Death of Art, in which the central plot point revolves around my attempt at cutting out my face in every fashion editorial I've ever appeared in, and kind of alongside that are snippets of analysis of season 5 of 90210. So that might give you an idea of how ingrained in pop culture my work is. And I think this is a really good piece that I think demonstrates that aesthetic, but also summarizes perhaps a synthesis of my new work. It's called Yes, We're Open, which is strangely inviting. And it came to me when I was at the MoMA with my girlfriend, and we were viewing Zoe Leonard's exhibit Analogs, which kind of compiles snapshots of storefronts and kind of catalogs the disappearance of mom and pop stores in New York City, particularly in the Lower East Side. And I started to see a pattern emerge, and so I took photos of as many storefront signs as I thought would create a narrative, and then I rearranged those. I cut those up and rearranged them to recycle it into another narrative. So this is my attempt at that. This is called Yes, We're Open. Yes, we're open. Lining and trimming, everything for men, hard to get items, cash, used, jewelry, come back, adding, machines, serve yourself. We have ice, family, meats, fresh, everyday, instant, repair, must, sell all, make, offer, and save. We drop off, pick up, 1 hour, photo fade, shave, boys, cut flat top, senior citizen. The end is near. Please remember to return, child welcome, permanent eyeliners, top and bottom, soft hair, it relaxes. We accept stamps, true desires of beauty does not fade in water, half off new issues and prints. Unisex images, Peep World, Cosmos for rent, boys for rent, citizens for rent, everything for men for rent. We sell at cheap price, quality and reliability, soft hair, permanent eyelashes, permanent lip liner, live poultry, last wash, suckling pigs, true desire with 2-time free retouch electrical appliances for the home. It relaxes. Yes, we're open. Entire store now 88 cents on special. Child issues. Drop off, pick up. Money is life. Please remember to return. Please, money. Please remember, money is near. Pick up, drop off. Remember, money is the end. So I think that also we get into issues of capitalism and a critique of consumer culture within those disappearing storefronts, mom and pop storefronts, to make way for corporations in New York City and elsewhere. And I think that segues nicely into this poem. You might, without me telling you where it's situated or where the idea for the poem came from, you might recognize certain images and maybe identify it yourself. But it really came to fruition when none other than John Gossley was visiting me here in Brooklyn. And we were at a store, we were grocery shopping, and we often we force each other into poetry prompts, not only to critique and reevaluate, I think, everyday life, but perhaps also to evaluate and reevaluate systems and signs of capital. So this is called Fruit is Good, Follow Orders. Now it's your turn. Does Judy know about customer service? The first question I've really asked myself today and been stumped, standing in line where a man and woman on either side of my body separate me into one of 3 other lines with flags for fare. At hand a hull of grapes, cheese, either a red pepper or tomato. So stumped again, return to earth and tell no one. Take solace in knowing there's another me in another city getting take out, whistling as he or I or you walk through the door, bells jangling to announce someone will soon ask, do you need assistance? And another sign says, fruit is good, mistaken for God on the glance of settlers and traders riding off into the unalterable sunset on my timeline. Say goodbye with love, yours truly, XOXO, comes from the Middle Ages and is meant to be the act of kneeling to kiss the Bible, and a derogatory term for Jews derived from the shape of a circle. Everything is always in opposition. I've had enough. Words to last me a lifetime, to outlast me, which is the point of any letter ever sent, kissed off with a parting phrase or polite suggestion, as in, wish you were here. It's funny, I just got in a discussion about the rising rents in New York City, but particularly where I live, in this beautiful studio apartment of mine in Cobble Hill, Brooklyn. And I think that kind of desperation is inherent in my work. I think it probably helps my work, both in poetry and prose. I mean, my recent novel is called Tourist Trap, and it's about cultural terrorism and tourism, but also terrorism in the sense that there's this recent college graduate that is desperate for money and takes a job as basically a terrorist for hire, somewhat unwittingly and then really consciously. And so I think that kind of desperation is also what provokes me. This is called wading, as if you were wading in water. And I think it was influenced by the rising rents, among other things. It also comes from Death of Art, which will be available in 2016 from CNR Press. Wading. Spit, paddle, stream, the sound of your voice. I could never know how far you like to enter without a lit-up sign to let you know exit, mouth, baby, in a bar. Put on your best tank top and bottom out the way a Bond villain drops into the black. As long as your air stops moving, my mouth full. I've never had enough of that, ambidextrous or just dexterous. 1 and 2 and meet up and let's play house. Make fire by making it move faster. I don't know. Once I told somebody, I don't know who I am when I am by myself. When I am buying myself on the streets, everyone stops open wide like no one, not even me. Magazines and video, so different depending on who I am inside of lately, like the weather. It comes and it goes. Do you know what that means? It means enough. People want to hear about fire. Everyone either gets it or they don't. The cost keeps rising. I told my friend it's through the roof, I said, and used my hands to show him. My studio has no fire escape. So yeah, I was thinking about my rising rent, but certainly I'm also talking about ways in which I think very much so our culture is a culture that has forgotten things like solitude, and it's kind of shamed the idea of being alone, which I think is so important to knowing who we are inside. And I think that's kind of a fitting end to end with this poem, which is called Hands-Free Talk to Me. And once again, I think the pop culture references are explicit and right away in the entry point. So this is Hands-Free Talk to Me, which of course we are doing right now because we're not on the cell phone. Hands-free talk to me, simply naked, nothing but a bag of Stacy's promise made with real baked pita bread. It's nice to know, and even better to have instructions. Store in a cool, dark place, close tightly after use. You fingered me as the one responsible for word hunger, brief aside to my live streaming webcam, which is playing Do the Right Thing. Half-eaten poems on the floor, more than 5 minutes. Do I dare? I do. Save me for a rainy day. Every head clouds without question. Everything appears at home on television. Sadness fills me like an index and a thumb holding a rubber ball, sulfuric acid, some oil. We used to play every other week, more or less. Import files, splice our voices, kill the rest. Thanks. That's all I got for you guys. Looking forward to all your questions, obviously.
See what questions we have. Mona, if you'd like to go ahead and join us, that would be great.
Hello again.
Hey there.
Wow.
I see that you fixed the blind situation, John.
Yeah, I fixed that by shifting to the right-hand side of this ass desk. Let's see. Robert from England asks, Chris and John are poetry brothers. Mona has pictures of her family behind her. Is creating a community of support important for a poet? And if so, how do you go about doing that in the 21st century? And is technology helping or hurting? So whoever would like to answer that first.
Do you want me to start things off, Mona?
Yes, I'd love to hear your
I mean, I think that it's interesting. I mean, that's really the crucial question, right? Is technology hurting or helping? And I think there's one critique that says technology, whereas we'd be more prone to do things in a face-to-face, very personal manner, technology has prevented us from doing that. But in other ways, like what we have today, technology has helped us do things that would otherwise be inaccessible, right? So I feel very much connected with Mona today, and I'm sure that that kinship will follow us after this broadcast. So I think to answer that question, I think it's so important, whether it's online like today or face-to-face, that you get involved in your communities, attend readings, celebrate the art that you yourself are trying to create and contribute to. One way to do that is to review the kind of work that you wanna celebrate and that you want to see in this world. It's not all about, for instance, going to readings to name drop or to see and meet other people so that you are seen, right? So that you meet other people. It's more about engaging at those opportunities, in those opportunities rather. And I think that that's sometimes often lost in a culture that necessarily is so egotistical in a way, because so much of writing is done alone, right? And at the same time, you'd like to be social and celebrate the artist around you and the art around you. And one way to do that, I think, is to go to as many readings, to write as much as you can about the artists that are important to you. And I think without that, you can't really be successful, or it's very rare to be successful as a poet or in any of the arts in this life. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a really eloquent reply, Chris, and I think it's a really important question because I think that I feel very much connected as a part of a community of poets, and things like Facebook and social media and things that, like this is kind of cutting edge,
Mhm.
so that we can have this. The technology allows us to do that, and that's incredible. But I think also, so it can be a real force for good. But I think it's a question of balance, and I sort of feel like I have children, so I sort of spend a lot of my time writing.
Yeah.
But I drop my kids off in the playground, and sort of making cheese sandwiches in the morning and dropping them off and having this interaction, and then coming back to my desk, and so I feel like that kind of sort of normalizes me a bit. But
Mhm.
I do think that I can imagine actually writing and doing a lot of being on the screen, not just one screen, many screens. I mean, my children are 11, and they are on screens the whole time, and I sort of feel that this kind of not looking up and sort of being, imbibing the world and being around and just hearing what's going on and stuff. I think I'm worried that that might be lost. What is it going to be replaced by? So I think it's a question of just sort of balance. And I mean, even just really simple things like, I don't know about you, Chris, but like I love writing, the actual physical act of writing on a page and using a pen and carrying a notebook. I love the idea of that. It's kind of this very primal thing of writing in a notebook, and even that, just being able to sort of, to me, is that feeling very connected with, the physicalness, the act of writing.
Very sensual.
Physical.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so I sort of feel, that's connected with it. I just feel like the physical world, being connected to the physical world, is really important. Being out and smelling a flower, or going into the woods and or just being on a bus and listening to conversations and imbibing what's around you. I just think that's integral to living and therefore writing, really.
Yeah, great. I think that reminds me of, I mean, that little intro I did for that Trader Joe. By the way, it was at Trader Joe's for
Oh.
food. And yeah, I mean, I think that we discount, you know, people say they have this conception of writer's block, but in poetry and in prose, I think it's irrelevant. I think your response was beautiful in that it does emphasize the fact that, look, before you write, you really need to live, and that could just mean as simple as getting groceries and seeing something that interests you. Whether it's a conversation or combining those signs of capitalism with conversation and doing something with it, but that you really are empowered to see the world differently when you realize that. I think, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we all ask essentially the sort of same questions in our poetry when we write. You know, we're all asking the same questions, and our subject matter, it doesn't really matter. We are asking the same questions, and it's a question of how we get there. And I think just sort of being in a room and not looking up is not going to get you there.
Yeah. Good question.
Yeah, very good question.
Let's see, our next question, I think those are both great answers. And before we move on to the next question, this reminds me of a poem of Joe Winderoth's that's always stuck in my mind since I read it many, many years ago in The Nation.
Mm-hmm.
It's called, like, I think, like Future Capitalism, something like that. Anyway, the lines of the poem is, "They are perfecting the pillow by which to smother you. Now it sings to you and shows you pictures." And that reminded me, Mona, what you said of that poem, you know, about like engaging with the world and rather than like passively taking in information. You know, there's a big difference between the cloud raining and the ground soaking up those nutrients. You know, and I think that it's important to develop well to be a little bit of both of those. So, Ellen Ron in New York says, oh, I wonder who this is from. Professor Campanioni, to what extent do you think technology inhibits our ability to notice the beauty and diversity around us, particularly on a New York City subway ride? What are your subway rides like? Also, how do you decide on the delivery? How did you decide on the delivery of your poetry today?
How did I decide on the delivery?
Whole question, subways and delivery, and I think the delivery part is maybe a good question for Mona as well. So go ahead, Chris.
Well, by delivery, I guess they mean how I read the poetry. I try to replicate the line breaks in the poem. A lot of my poetry, I think, finds its source of power through those line breaks. So I try to show that, even if I can't show what's on the page. But to answer your question about inhibiting via technology, I think it was important for me to read that first poem, Talk Talk, not only because I think it does show so much of my cultural background and interest in a linguistic tradition that is actually conflation and combining things and merging them along with pop culture, but I think also, as minor literature is cited in its recent synthesis of my work, something that I probably didn't realize, that it does celebrate technology for the implications technology might have to unite people in different ways. So I think it's both, like we all have kind of mentioned in the first question, it's good and bad, and I think it's how you use technology, and I think the cultural norms, the social norms for using technology is unfortunately not going in that direction, but we ourselves can reevaluate how we use social media, how we use Twitter, how we're using, I guess, Google Chrome, which I didn't even have before today. I downloaded and installed it. So, and more and more for this practice to be the norm instead of the exception. I often write on my phone, actually, on my notes section, and I often write in the subway. So I think it's great that that question kind of delved into environments in New York City that I think are ripe with opportunity and stories. And I think any sort of being in transit, both emotionally but also physically, is always a great starter for anything, especially poetry. I'm not sure if I answered their question totally, but maybe they'll write in a follow-up. So.
Yeah, that sounds good. Mona, how did you decide on the delivery of what your work and what you were going to read today?
Yeah.
Did you take the tube in England there?
Do you know, I totally get what Chris is saying about the idea of the journeying with the poem. I do that an awful lot. I also write on my phone. I carry a notebook, but walking the actual there's sort of a music in your head, and then you're walking. That kind of thing really helps, and also it really helps to if you have a poem that's sort of stuck. I feel that there's something about the motion of it that really helps too. But in terms of delivery, which is what the questioner asked, yeah, line breaks. But I feel like when I write the poem, I've scored the voice, and the really anyone should be able to pick up the poem, and if I've done a good enough job on the poem, they should be able to read it, and there should be the music that is inherent in the poem should be there. And I think with delivery, I mean the first poem that I read was The Line, and I'm always really conscious because I used to be a lawyer, and before I turned to poetry, and so people are always asking me about, oh, how could a boring, bland lawyer dealing with rule-bound cases all day write poetry? So I'm sort of very aware of that because that's often in the introduction. So I kind of always want to start with a poem that is slightly surreal, where I'm taking big imaginative leaps, and that is kind of making the listener is sort of slightly giddy by some of the. So I kind of start with something. I often start with that poem. So I kind of have different kind of concerns that. So I want to start strong with a poem that's out there. That answer your question?
Yeah, I think that's that's a good answer too. I mean, there's always, I think, a process in writing a poem that for me is partially taken from the space that I'm in, alongside, those things that we all remember. Let's see what other questions we have here, if any. And if not, I think you should each ask each other a question. Yeah, I think that would be good. So Mona, why don't you go ahead first?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about something that we've been talking about in England, or the United Kingdom, quite a lot, about the prose poem and what a poetry is, and the boundary of what of a poem, and when is a poem not a poem, and that instinct for knowing that what you're dealing with when you're in the environment for writing is actually a poem, or if it's something else, if it's flash fiction, or if it's the beginning of a story. And I'm really interested in that, in exploring that, and I just wondered what your views were on that, Chris.
Yeah, I think poetry has that advantage over other, whatever you want to call them, genres, mediums, in that it is sort of inherently boundless and boundaryless, so that I think explicitly I make that clear through like this forthcoming work, which I read mostly from today, Death of Art, which really combines prose and poetry, and it's all poetry. But I think more and more, and we kind of discussed this before the broadcast, there seems to be actually young people, and actually poets of all ages, but just today, rather than perhaps in years past, people are less reluctant to really, I think, experiment with forms and call it poetry in terms of, there's a lot of, like, the list poems, and I think poems that might otherwise read as flash fiction. And I think I've never really made distinctions in my work. I mean, I do have 2 novels and I have 2 poetry collections, right? And this will be technically my first memoir, but I think all of them have used a poetic expression, if not also the poetic form. And I think the only difference is now that I think more and more the rest of the culture is catching on to the fact that, look, as a poet, because poetry is responding to so much, I think that you are free to kind of create without constraints, in which, look, a novel has to do certain things, right? There's certain parameters that a novel has to follow. Poetry doesn't. And so I've always felt that way, and I'm glad that this seems to be a movement that is quite popular, or growing, at least so, today. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good question too. And I think the difference between like poetry and prose poetry is really not very large, except in the intentionality and the volition of the work itself. I think that poetry in and of itself tends to be much more characterized, and the words are chosen much more acutely than in fiction or of course, novels or something like that. And I think that's what sets it apart. Also.
Yeah, the density of word choice and meaning, for sure, I think. And that's why I think, actually, if you can write poetry, you can write anything else rather than writing everything else and being able to write poetry, because poetry, a training in poetry, will teach you not only the importance of word choice, but also rhythm, speed, meter, all sorts of things, imagery, of course. But there's a density of language that is not necessarily present in something like a novel or a memoir, I think.
Yeah, and I would agree with you on that. Hemingway said, first I tried to become a poet and write poetry. Then I tried to write short stories, and then I became a novelist. And I always like to add, and then you killed yourself.
Well,
Mona, I think you had something to say there.
Yeah, I was going to say that partly I think what happens is it's instinctive, and you are shaping something, and it's almost like a smell. You kind of recognize the smell of something, and you recognize it, and you certainly get better at recognizing, of sort of honing your instinct for knowing what you're dealing with. I mean, I have to say that I think it's really interesting, those boundaries, those lines that are, we think are drawn, and I think they're quite interesting to exploit. And I think some of those experiments with poetry that's at the boundaries is really, really interesting. I think it really pays off. I've got a couple of, actually 3 or 4 prose poems in my collection, which I sort of felt that, if I'd lineated them, they would have been very musical. They would have had a very kind of lyrical quality about them, but they've become something very different in the prose poem. So I don't know. I sort of feel like instincts at play as well, and I just think it's really interesting, and I think it's a really interesting time to be writing poetry.
I wonder, have you looked at those poems before they were published in some versions? Did you decide to have a sort of lineation for those prose poems, and how did the reading itself change? How did the meaning change when you retranslated them into line breaks and perhaps stanzas?
They felt as if they were coming from a different space.
Mm-hmm.
They had a different imaginative zone. And I really felt, I mean, at the time, I even thought perhaps this is fiction, perhaps this is a short story or flash fiction. But actually, I think it was the manipulation and the maneuvering that I did as a poet that kind of made me think that this was something else entirely. And then I just dispense with the line breaks, and it's very clear to me that they are poems that are in sort of blocks of prose. And also I found that the prose poem, I'm really interested in the prose poem. I think for that reason, I think that I mean the US has such a great tradition of writing prose poetry, and I'm sort of really influenced by that with my prose poems. But I think the idea of sort of hijacking the reader a little bit, sort of the reader thinks they're reading prose, and it has a certain sort of a lack of ambiguity because you know where you're going with it. You feel safe. You don't feel safe in a poem usually.
Yeah.
And certainly not in a good poem. I want to feel risk in a poem. So that idea of sort of playing with that, with the reader's expectation, and then sort of subverting that in a prose poem is really, really interesting. I mean, there's one prose poem in my book called Mr. Bahari's Marriage Bureau, which I didn't read, but it's about a woman, an Indian woman, a traditional Indian woman going to a clinic. It's called a marriage bureau, but it's actually a clinic where she's ostensibly going to go and get a new husband. But there's something much more sinister going on. So she sees a doctor, and the doctor basically is putting her to sleep. And I found that I wanted to write about these really difficult issues, and about women in Indian society, and I really, really couldn't do that in any other way apart from sort of through the back door through writing this poem in this way. And it's a prose poem, and it's very oblique, and I really felt that the form was right for it.
Yeah, so that's one way to think about poets, I guess. We are manipulators, or we're able to cash in on this level of reevaluating expectations, generic expectations that perhaps novelists and essayists and short story writers aren't, I think. But because I write all of those things, I could say that and know that that's true. Yeah.
Well, I think that I think this discussion has been very good. It's been very interesting. We're going to go ahead and wrap up here today. So thank you very much, Manu, for speaking today. Thank you also, Chris. And
thanks for watching. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
it's amazing. Thank you, Robert, who put this on.
Yes, thank you, Robert, too.
yeah, and I think next month we'll actually be taking a hiatus from the Transatlantic Poetry Series, which will reconvene next year. So hopefully you all are able to tune in for that, and I know I will be. So thank you everybody for watching today, and this was Mona Arshi and Chris Campanioni, and I'm John Gosling, the editor of Prose Review, Pank Magazine, and director of CNR Press. Have a wonderful rest of the Sunday.
See ya.
Bye. Thank you.